I was asked to introduce our two speakers, Paul Volcker and Toyoo Gyohten, two men who, frankly, don't really need much of an introduction, particularly to this crowd. So I will keep that part of the evening quite brief. They share a lot in common. Mr. Volcker graduated from Princeton University in 1949. Mr. Gyohten attended for a year in 1956. Both went on to incredible careers in public service, in economics and international finance. They witnessed firsthand, at first as sort of junior members at the table, the developments of historic events in the creation of the post-war financial and economic order, and have talked a lot about the interesting things that they saw. One in particular, I remember reading something that Mr. Gyohten talked about, was the early ages of Japan sort of coming into its own in the post-war order, and describing the role of Japan in these international discussions, the bureaucrats of following the rule of the three S's, which was silent, smiling, and sometimes sleeping. Obviously, that role evolved, and both men went from just witnessing these events to shaping them. Mr. Volcker obviously went on to become chairman of the Federal Reserve, Mr. Gyohten to become the Vice Minister of Finance. Together they participated in some of the most important events in post-war history, such as the Plaza Accord of 1985, the Louvre Accord that came a couple years later. They both retired from public service in the late 1980s, but of course, retirement is not an accurate word for either of them. They remained quite active. Mr. Gyohten went on to become the chairman of the Bank of Tokyo and now runs the Institute for International Monetary Economics, International Monetary Affairs, headquartered right next to the Bank of Japan. Mr. Volcker has done a number of things, including creating the rule named after himself, the Volcker Rule, which I know has created a lot of gnashing of teeth among the bankers who are in this audience, something that I think he probably gets great delight out of, and is now head of the Volcker Alliance, which is still putting out important papers on public affairs. One thing that you may or may not know about them that they share is that the two of them, after retiring from government jobs, agreed to teach a seminar together in 1990, 1991 at their alma mater of Princeton University at the Wilson School, or perhaps what I should say is what was at the time called the Wilson School. And the product of that joint seminar was a remarkable book called Changing Fortunes, The World's Money and the Threat to American Leadership, which they authored together. And if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. In preparation for this evening, I went through the book, and I'm going to use that as the framework for our discussion. So with that, I please invite our distinguished speakers to the stage. Thank you. So let me start actually by, as I say, talking to you about this book and sort of revisiting that. And I want to start with you, Mr. Gyohten. And you wrote in your portion of the introduction of this book, the U.S. Japan alliance, quote, was an historic success. In a way, it was too successful. Both sides took it for granted, even when the fundamental situation changed. So I wanted to start by asking, what did you mean by that? And how would you, both of you, describe what you consider the state of the alliance today?
Well, the situation today is quite different from 20 years ago when we wrote this book. Changes took place both in the United States and in Japan, and also international surroundings. Well, I think the situation we are in today is quite different in the sense that the joint clout, economic clout of two countries certainly diminished to some extent. Why? I think for the United States, that was at least partly due to its, what shall I say, imperial overreach.
Okay.
And for Japan, I think it was certainly due to our loss of confidence. So we were in a different world.
Okay.
But I think we can retrieve that loss by our own efforts. So I think, I'll be talking about the future a little bit, but at least the change took place between 20 years ago and today is quite significant.
Mr. Volcker, would you care to describe sort of the current state of U.S.-Japan relations and how that alliance had changed?
Well, when you talk about the state of the relationship when the time that book was written, what came to my mind is about the time another book was written called Japan is Number One.
Right, by Ezra Vogel, yes.
And it was a very popular book, and it reflected the fact that Japan had, at that stage, come after, 2 or 3 decades of growth that really hadn't been seen before in any large industrialized country. The United States had, at that stage, gone through some uncertain periods of high inflation and stagflation and so forth. So the United States was, I think, concretely still number one, but we didn't have the same confidence that we'd had 20 years earlier. And Japan was of growing confidence, and they were the big boys in the world, and they were the newcomers anyway. And Europe, of course, was there, but Europe had its own problems. So the world was kind of Japan and the United States from one point of view.
Right. And we'll get more to how that changed and what the current relationship is, particularly vis-a-vis other powers, a little bit later. I wanted to actually move back to the beginning a little bit. You were both witnesses to some of the most important moments in post-war economic history and post-war U.S.-Japan economic history. We talked a little bit about this beforehand. So I'd like to ask you first, Mr. Gyohten, what is your memory of first meeting Paul Volcker? Where did you first meet, and what do you recall about that?
My memory is fading because of my age, but I believe the first time I met him was in his office in the Treasury, probably sometime during 1970. I remember that now. He was in his office.
You had a more vivid description, I think.
That's right. Well, you know, this gentleman used to be a very heavy smoker of cigar, big cigar. And he was smoking cigar in his office. He had his feet on the desk, puffing a big cigar. And I have to suffer a sense of awe, you know. And the scene was, exactly a painting titled "Arrogance."
Would you care to respond?
But
okay,
why did I come to like him? I think because
I could hardly see you through the cigar smoke.
I think, when we were talking to each other, sometimes we had to have a very hard discussion, but, the smile he gives occasionally, not very often, but was so naive and innocent. So I thought any man who can make this kind of smile cannot be a bad guy. And also, more seriously, what he used to say almost always had, something reasonable. So that's why, although at first I thought this was a very arrogant guy, but in fact I liked him because of his innocent smile and the very reasonable arguments you made.
Good.
Thank you.
So,
Winning argument.
so this was in 1971, you said.
Right.
And at the time, Mr. Volcker was in the Treasury.
Right.
And talk a little bit about what that was leading up to, the discussions and your memories of how the Treasury Secretary at the time, John Connally, treated Japan.
Well, I don't remember the precise occasion upon meeting Toyo, but in 1971, we were, in my view, approaching a crisis in international monetary affairs. The United States had begun running a deficit. Other countries were slowly, not very aggressively, demanding gold for their dollar accumulation. Japan was the biggest dollar accumulator in those days with a very large surplus. They were not demanding gold. They had no interest in buying gold, but they were building up their dollar holdings. And we had a situation, I think, that ultimately so-called Bretton Woods system with fixed exchange rates came under stress. And by summer, it all kind of came to an end. Wasn't the end of the world, but it was the end of the fixed exchange rates when the United States unilaterally, the only way it could be done is unilaterally, decided to no longer promise the exchange for gold for dollars at $35 an ounce. That was sacred when I grew up in the Treasury. I had, I guess, a disappointing experience of growing up in the Treasury where defense of the $35 an ounce gold was truly considered sacred, and I had to be there as, in fact, the principal officer as Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs. That was my beat, doing domestic and international financial affairs, and got involved in having the sense to pull the plug. Mr. Nixon made the decision, obviously, in the end.
But your immediate boss was John Connolly?
My immediate boss then was John Connolly, yes.
And what was his view of how Japan should be played?
Well,
the role Japan should play?
On a personal level, I always had pretty good relationships with the Japanese officials, and I think Toyo reciprocated that. We had problems with Japan because they were running a big surplus. We were running a deficit, and it seemed something, something had to be done. Mr. Connolly was not a great monetary expert, but he had very strong instincts. A lot of his instincts were pretty good. But he was fiercely of the opinion that something had to be done about this Japanese surplus. From the time he took office, he became Treasury Secretary, I guess, in January of '71. He had been involved with then President Nixon in an investigation of governmental reorganization. Nixon was very impressed by him. At that time, Connolly was still a Democrat, but Mr. Nixon thought he walked on water, practically, appointed him Secretary of the Treasury, took a very strong view, and he took a very strong view, particularly that something had to be done about this Japanese surplus, and threatened verbally and otherwise some pretty strong measures in the way of tariffs, or I remember a great expression he had that you could see all those cars lined up on the docks of Yokohama and we wouldn't permit them to be imported in the United States. No, he never carried out those threats, but he was pretty aggressive.
This culminated in the Smithsonian.
It culminated, well, after we suspended the gold settlement, and there was an interim period of floating exchange rates, and then ultimately the Smithsonian tried to put it back together again.
And what is your memory of the Smithsonian meetings?
You know, this so-called Bretton Woods regime, I think Japan was the biggest beneficiary of the system because the system provided Japan with a very stable, predictable exchange rate between the dollar and the yen. $1 equal 360 yen. And also, the United States, well, very generously opened its market for Japanese export. So Japan could thrive and make quick growth during this 25 years period of Bretton Woods regime from 45 to 71. But this system was upheld only because of the existence of the hegemonic superpower, the United States. And it costed the United States because it has to run a large trade deficit, and eventually U.S. could anymore uphold this dollar convertibility with a gold. So that event was a big turning point for the post-war economic development for Japan.
So fast forward to 1985, the Bretton Woods system had broken down. There was still attempts to control exchange rates. And then came the Plaza Accord, which you both played a very big role in. Talk about your personal memories of the Plaza negotiations and sort of what you think now, looking back on it. We just marked the 30th anniversary of the significance of what that moment was. Mr. Volcker, would you like to go first?
Well, the Plaza Accord followed a period of a very strong appreciation of the United States dollar, the opposite of the situation in '71 when the dollar was under pressure and weak. We had had fairly high interest rates during the 1980s. I happened to be chairman of the Federal Reserve at that point, and the dollar had gotten very strong, and there was some concern, among other things, that was contributing to disequilibrium, including a renewed deficit in the United States payments, but also to protectionist pressures in the United States. So after being very reluctant to do anything about it, and an earlier Treasury administration anyway, there was a feeling that something ought to be done to bring the dollar back down, and the other side of that would be to put the yen up to create a better competitive position for the United States. And at that point, Jim Baker had become Secretary of the Treasury, and he was instinctively more concerned about the international financial system, and he's certainly concerned about the dollar. So he largely had the idea, why don't we get together and with our major trading partners, but preeminently Japan, and see whether we can make sure the dollar declines to an appropriate level, and presumably some further assumption, not very explicit, that we see what we could do to stabilize exchange rates thereafter. Exchange rates had been through a decade of great instability at that point, ups and downs by 25% or so against European currencies or the yen. So he called this meeting of the so-called Group of Five, which had existed in the five biggest monetary countries. That was the coordinating mechanism at the time, to the extent we were coordinating, to develop a program, an agreed program for depreciating the dollar. And I hated to use that word, depreciate the dollar, but that's what we were doing, appreciating the yen. And there had been some discussions before the meeting, but the final decision was made at the Plaza in New York and announced that day. The dollar had been declining irregularly for 6 months or so, but not as fast as Mr. Baker and otherwise would have wished. And we were running a big deficit. Now the burden was basically on Japan as to how big a depreciation they would accept. And I don't remember who the Japanese finance minister was at the time, but he kind of surprised us a little bit by willing to accept the notion of a bigger
went on to become prime minister.
Appreciation and a bigger appreciation.
What do you remember about that?
Well, certainly I endorse that Plaza Agreement was quite an effective international cooperation effort. However, I am not too sure whether that particular action was really necessary, because well, in hindsight, you can tell that the dollar already passed the peak of its strength in the early part of that year, and because of that, the joint action with a big propaganda, dollar fell so rapidly and so
We don't
irregularly.
consider that propaganda. It was a carefully considered exchange of views on
And
the evolution of the
you are
economic
the
system.
only guy who expressed his concern that this may create excessive collapse of the dollar. And it did happen. And for Japan, although we were of the view that because of this large trade surplus, appreciation of the yen to some extent was really necessary, and we are quite willing to cooperate with others, but we did not expect the fall could take place in that magnitude. And that has created a big, big problem for the Japanese economy later.
Toyo is quite right about my feeling, and I guess his feeling too. The dollar had been coming down, and as chairman of the Federal Reserve and with a principal responsibility for maintaining the stability of the American financial system, I was not too happy about deliberately driving the dollar down and didn't want it to get out of hand. Had a lot of internal discussions about that. In the end, it did not take a lot of pushing. And of course, we made an announcement that subtly suggested that we would welcome some decline in the dollar or appreciation of the yen. But it didn't take much. There was some intervention, but the dollar went down by itself pretty well.
So we started out by talking a little bit about the current state of Japan and U.S. Japan relations. And as you mentioned, that seemed like the moment of great Japanese power, but it created the problems that Japan in some ways is still wrestling with today. I'd like to get both of your assessments right now on the current state of the Japanese economy, and whether you think, as some people think, that it's sort of fatally heading toward the brink of continued demographic collapse, or whether you actually see signs of prospects of hope for Japan.
Well, this Abenomics has become a very popular jargon in the world financial world. I think when we talk about Abenomics, we have to ask 3 questions. Number 1, will it work? Second, will it not cause long-term problem for the Japanese economy? Third, couldn't we have done something else?
And what are your brief answers to those 3 questions?
To the first question, my answer is, yes, so far it's working. But we are still unable to declare final victory, because what is most crucially important in this exercise is to secure smooth and efficient transmission from the initial quantitative and qualitative easing to benefit the real economy, consumption, investment, trade, etc., etc. And we have seen already a very positive impact of this QQE policy in terms of the corporate performance and also in asset market performance. So that's good. But we haven't seen yet that the real economy is really benefiting from this initial. Second, yes, it may create a problem in the future. This excessive expansion of monetary liquidity creation may cause some problem. But I think it will all depend how we can make appropriate exit from this policy. And so that is something to come in the coming couple of years. Third question, I don't think we had no alternative. That's why I support Abenomics, because we had nothing else.
Mr. Volcker, what's your view of the current state of Japan's economy and prospects?
Well, Japan is the favorite whipping boy of economic commentary these days, and all economists outside of Japan think they know how they would have done it better. I'm not sure it was all that possible to do it all that much better. People kind of forget 2 things. One is that Japan had a very severe financial crisis to start this all off. You remember the days when everybody said that the value of land around the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was worth all of California.
Right.
That kind of hubris and feeling existed. Japanese stock market was wherever it was, both real estate prices and Japanese stock market declined by about 75% over the space of a year or two. It's about double of what happened in the United States when we thought we had a great crisis, and it presented very difficult adjustment problems for Japan. And at a time when demographically Japan was changing, and you have for the past 10 years or so have a decline in Japanese population and in its working age population, about 1% a year. People forget about that, so they say, gee, Japan's only increased by 1%. Well, it's 2% in real terms for the average worker, which is about what we're doing. I mean, our labor force is going up potentially 1% a year. Theirs is going down 1%. There should be a 2% difference, which nobody talks about because we're not doing that much better. So I think you have problems of morale and confidence and all the rest when your population is declining, labor force is declining, but the unemployment rate has not been very high, certainly compared to ours. So I'm not sure that Japan deserves all the obloquy that it has had. It's had a struggle to get it going, but
Did you want to jump in?
Yeah. Well, as Paul said, that it is quite true that Japanese economy have several very serious fundamental problems. But I think you have to remember that Japan somehow is a country who had to face with quite large number of really serious problems ahead of other countries in the world. Nuclear pollution,
Right.
And water contamination, all sorts of natural disasters, earthquake, tsunami, whatever. And this aging population, small shrinking labor force, et cetera, et cetera. So I think Japan, during the last 70 years after the Second World War, faced with so many difficult problems one after another. But somehow, as Paul said, we are still surviving, although at a very anemic pace. So I personally am reasonably optimistic about the future. Of course, we need lots of works.
we're speaking as a Japan society, so we have to be optimistic.
Right.
I think it's what Bank of Japan Governor Shirakawa used to call Japan as the lonely front runner. So I think it's time now to turn this over to questions from the audience. If anybody does have a question, raise your hand, and I think a microphone will come around. Please make sure to identify yourself and speak loudly for your question. Oh, sorry. They're in the fourth row, sorry.
What are you passing around?
Chairman Volcker,
Sure, please identify yourself.
Govind Singh, during your period, there was a time when money was so tight that money will not be available at any cost. Versus today, money is at zero interest rate or lower. What the two policies have, do they have a common? What did they do right for the economics? And if I may follow up with Mr. Gyohten, Abenomics versus Reaganomics, would you like to talk about it?
So the two questions, one is, there was a time when, during your chairmanship, when money was not available at any cost, when interest rates were high and policy was very tight.
It
And
was
now
available at very high cost.
right, and now available at zero cost. How would you compare and contrast those policies?
Well, the condition of the economy is quite different. We were fighting a historically high inflation rate in the United States. The United States, by and large, has had a pretty stable currency. It had some inflation in the Civil War, a little inflation in the Korean War, a little bit after World War II, but basically something around 2 or 3% would have been high in the United States. During the 1960s, it was virtually zero. But in the 1980s, in the late 1970s, in the early 1980s, it got up to about 15% at an annual rate. It was an unhappy period. Unemployment was high, the economy was slow, and interest rates were very high. So we had very restrictive monetary policies, which made interest rates even higher. The interbank rate, I guess, reached 20% at one point. And we had a sizable recession. We had a very rapid recovery, and stability was restored. We had a happy late 1980s. We had a happy 1990s. We had an indifferent early 20th century, and it all ended up in a in a big problem. And that problem is reflected, as in the case of Japan, with a very easy monetary policy, with actions beyond any historic experience. And it's been maintained there because the economy has not been terribly robust, but it's growing. So you had the two ends of the spectrum. You had a very tight money policy, but in the midst of a very inflationary period, you've got an extremely easy monetary policy and a period of price stability.
Let me ask a brief follow-up on that, which is, so you faced the challenge of breaking inflation, and you succeeded.
No question.
It seems that the current central bank governors around the world, particularly in the U.S. and Japan, are having a much harder time creating inflation.
Yeah, well,
Why is that so much harder than breaking deflation?
Well, I'm happy about that. I don't like inflation. Why they make so much effort to create inflation
Fair enough.
is not my cup of tea, but it is the fashion among central banks. And it is interesting that it is so difficult to do so following this massive financial crisis, which affected confidence and outlook, as in Japan, where it's lasted for a long time, but Japan had a natural tendency toward price stability, that we're beginning to get in a position, I guess are in a position, where the expectation is of price stability. I think that's a good thing, frankly, but so I'm not worried about getting out of it.
And the follow-up for you, Mr. Gyohten, was, is Abenomics just a recycled Reaganomics?
No, I don't think so. The situation is quite different. In the Japanese case, I think the whole problem started with a huge size of the bubble. That was the single most important cause of this current problem. And therefore, the effect or the burst of the bubble was so severe. So that's why it took so long to recover. And the problem is that this huge collapse of the bubble created a big, very strong sense of, well, disappointment or people have lost any positive side toward the future. And how to restore this animal spirit, so to say, is a big problem. And that's why I said the current Abenomics introduced a kind of shock therapy to try to alter this mindset. But that is still a problem for us.
Let me
please.
just make another point. This period has been the rise of China, an enormous competitive force, and the rest of Asia in particular, which had a big impact on what Japan was good at, which was efficient manufacturing. So they've had to struggle not only with the result of the massive bubble, but a competitive factor more powerful than anything they had to deal with earlier in the post-war period.
Right. And let's see, first you on the left there, and then if someone could get a second microphone to the gentleman in the back of the blue and red striped tie, please. And remember to identify yourself. Yes, thank you.
Hello. My name is David Bunt. Question about the rise of China, which many will say is the single largest geopolitical economic issue facing the world today. Tensions in the South China Sea can easily, I think, be acknowledged as over-aggression by China. But how can we argue with China about currency manipulation and too much government involvement in business with the state-owned enterprises when we have Japan devaluing the currency by 30%, say, in recent years, and the U.S. still having two very large state-owned enterprises in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac?
Thank you. So the question was first, how can we criticize China for currency manipulation when Japan under Abenomics has done this huge devaluation? And the second is, how can we criticize China for its state-owned enterprises when the U.S. has its own state-owned enterprises in the form of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? So
I'm not criticizing China's manipulation. So that question is not
okay.
to me.
You were shaking your head, so
No, this currency manipulation business, I don't think is appropriate. We have a lot of currency volatility because of imbalances in the real economy in Europe and in China as well. If the Chinese are manipulating, I don't think they're manipulating very effectively at the moment, frankly. You know, China is going to be a big challenge to reach a peaceful accommodation. So far, it's been reasonably peaceful. Of course, we got problems in the South China Sea. I hope they are contained, a political problem. But economically, we have the symbolism, and I think it is symbolism at this point, that the RMB is going to be part of the
IMF.
IMF currency. I don't think that's very meaningful in any actual reality at the moment, but it is symbolic of the Chinese intention, presumably, to have a more open financial market, or they couldn't justify their being put into the official basket of currencies. So I think China, it's a struggle, but they are a lot more open than they were 10 or 20 years ago, I'll tell you that. And I think it's really irreversible. If we could get rid of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, I think that would be terrific. And it shouldn't be an excuse for Japan to have state-owned enterprises.
Okay, thank you. Oh, please, go ahead. Yes.
Well, I think the inclusion of renminbi in the SDLR components is more of the symbolic effect, and I don't think there is any real meaning in that. But I hope that this inclusion of renminbi will expedite Chinese further efforts to bring about a complete convertibility for their renminbi. That's my hope.
There was a question back there, and then next, the gentleman in the second row.
Thanks. It's Brian Kelly with Asian Centric Quest. Thank you so much to both of you for making time for sharing your views with us tonight. I wanted to specifically ask about the issues of China, to carry on from the previous question. You were both, as Mr. Schlesinger pointed out, witness to some of the most historic monetary developments in both Japan and in the U.S. over the last 50 years. China is approaching a very unique situation here. Japan took 10 years of letting its currency float before it really liberalized its capital account. The Chinese RMB, as you both pointed out, is still, roughly speaking, pegged to the dollar. And yet they're both looking to, both these two factors are looking to occur over the course of the next couple of years as China quickly liberates its capital account and moves in a direction that would imply the sequencing could be challenging for that country. Given the experience of Japan and the fragility associated with too rapid of embracing of this type of sequencing, could you share your views as to how you think this will play out and what potential pitfalls could occur to the Chinese?
Basically, sort of Japan had its own problems, as you noted, with the sharp devaluation after the Plaza Accord. The question is, China in some ways is facing a similar challenge, and how do you, given Japan's experience, how do you see the Chinese attempt to manage the sort of change in its exchange rate smoothly, or perhaps not?
I don't think Chinese renminbi is experiencing the same kind of a very rapid appreciation now, which can be compared with the yen's appreciation after the Plaza Accord. Renminbi is still under control, and I think Chinese authorities are in favor of gradually appreciating renminbi. So I don't know, how can you compare the current Chinese situation with the Japanese
I think it
situation?
has more to do with just more conceptually shifting from, obviously a very tightly controlled exchange regime to a liberalization, which, as you say, they want to do it gradually, but it's sort of like being a little bit pregnant. It's hard to be a little bit sort of deregulated, right? You either are or you're not. And so the challenge is whether China can really manage that transition smoothly.
Well, China's in the midst of an adjustment. It's going to take some time from a very heavy concentration on investment and infrastructure that was taking 50% or more of their GDP, while consumption was 30% or 35%, and they want to shift toward more consumption and less investment, which the whole rest of the world would welcome as well. But it's not an easy adjustment, and they've got an internal debt problem, as other countries did, and they have had a certain amount of, I say capital flight. There's a certain amount of capital exported, let me at least say that, and less capital running in, which puts some pressure on their exchange rate. Now they have a huge amount of reserves, but they've spent quite a few of those reserves in slowing the appreciation of the RMB, which under the circumstance I think is probably appropriate. From my point of view, we have too much volatility in exchange rates. Sometimes Japanese yen is going from, I don't know, 80 to the dollar not too long ago to wherever it is now. And the euro is going from less than equality to the dollar to 50% above and now back down again. And we'd like to see a little more stability. Liking to see a little more stability and having the capacity to achieve it has so far been very elusive. And I think it's going to remain elusive for a while.
One thing that came across in your book was a sign of nostalgia for that golden age when the U.S., as you called it, was the hegemon and you had stability. That broke down when you sort of went from that U.S. Dominance to a G5, a G7. Now you have a G20 that's much more raucous. Is there any prospect, do you think, for meaningful discussion of exchange rate stability in that world?
I wish there were, but I don't really see it, honestly, at the moment. And you talk about a group of 20, getting a group of 20 to make any decisions at all is extremely difficult. You're going to be in the midst of a very large crisis to get any consensus on how to act. And nobody is sufficiently concerned about the exchange rate volatility to really do the difficult things that are required to maintain it. And you've got this wonderful picture of the Eurozone. They decided they wanted stability. I had a lot of sympathy for that. I still do, but they are sure in the midst of a crisis about how to maintain it.
Well, I share his concern, and I think what the economy really needs is stability and certain degree of predictability of exchange rate. And I think these two things, stability and predictability, can be achieved only when there is a very strong consensus among major currency countries. So the question is it feasible to organize that kind of consensus today? Well, when G5 was very active until 1985, there was a place for discussion and a place for agreement of this kind. But now I'm afraid we are totally lack of that kind of willingness on the part of the major currency countries. So,
Please. Sir. And then next, the gentleman on the right there. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm Robert Van Berry from Pace University. A few years ago, a book was published under the name of Exorbitant Privilege, referring to the privileges accruing to the United States from the fact that the dollar is the leading reserve currency. In a few days, my new book will be published under the title of Exorbitant Burden, identifying the fact that the US dollar's reserve currency status imposes significant burdens on our economy. Now that the renminbi is joining the reserve currency basket, do you think that China is getting an exorbitant privilege or an exorbitant burden? And why would they want to take on an exorbitant burden?
Is China's goal to become one of the world's reserve currencies
Well,
privilege
they-
or a burden? That's the.
They seem to attach a lot of prestige to being part of the SDR, and this is kind of an indication that they are part of the integral part of the world financial system and economic system. And I think they are, but it has some implications for their own policies and creates potential limitations, or not potential, actual limitations on what they should be doing.
What are the impositions that it places
Well,
on
one
China?
is if you really want to be a world currency, you can't have the degree of controls that they have maintained. You have to permit capital to come in and permit capital to flow out. And they've been permitting capital to flow out in pretty good style recently. But they have to have an economy that is not dependent upon external surpluses all the time. This is a problem goes on. It's a central problem of the international monetary system, international economic system. People talk about the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. There's no question that the dollar has permitted the United States to run bigger deficits than it could otherwise run. I don't know whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. It's an exorbitant way to be able to hang yourself over a period of time because you want some discipline. But Toyota, it's very hard to get together on the basic policies that are necessary cooperatively to maintain stability in the exchange market and maintain openness. China joining the SDR, if it means anything, it is symbolic at this point. If it means anything, it's they want to be part of an open world economy, which I think is fine.
You want to jump in?
I think China has absolutely no idea or intention to make renminbi the global reserve currency. They studied the experience of the dollar very well. And they discovered, in addition to some benefit of seigniorage by being the reserve currency, there's a tremendous amount of burden and sacrifice you have to pay for that. And I'm pretty sure that China has no desire to make the renminbi. Oh, of course, they want to make renminbi much widely usable currency in the world, particularly for their own trade capital transactions, but not more.
I'm sure
We
they
have-
like to conduct their own trade in RMB.
We have time for one more question, I think. And we've already allocated it. Apologies for everybody else. Please identify yourself.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Schlesinger. Well, thank you again to the three of you, Mr. Schlesinger, Gyohten-san, and Chairman Volcker. So thank you so much for the history lesson as well. My name is Hua Nguyen. I'm from the corporate bank team at Citigroup. And so the gold standard of the 19th century dissolved into depression and chaos in 1930s. And the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rate collapsed in 1970s to be replaced by a freewheeling system of floating currencies and mobile capital, as you mentioned. And the euro-dollar market was at the heart of the 2007-2008 crisis because the dollar depositors and the bond investors in European banks got panicked and they refused to carry on funding them, but instead they're piling them into the safe havens of treasuries, and then because of that, causing a run. And so we have the interbank rates in London soaring very high relative to American interest rate. And at that point in time, the Fed was forced to provide over $1 trillion of liquidity by lending them to foreign banks through their American subsidiaries and by extending swap lines to friendly central banks in Europe, Japan, Singapore, South Korea. And as we know, the dollar dominance as a global currency is become more and more important as emerging market economy get bigger and more finance intensive, and the use of the dollar will also increase. And the lesson of 07-08 crisis is that run in the offshore dollar system can bring down the entire financial system. So the last time around, we have the Fed as the lender of last resort. The question is, if we run into a similar situation again, can the Fed do it again?
So the question
You
was,
can answer that question.
and, the Fed was the lender of last resort to save us from catastrophe in 2007, 2008. Can the Fed do it again?
2017?
In 2007, 2008, during the financial crisis, the Fed was the lender of last resort to prevent collapse. Could the Fed do that again today if it had to?
Oh, certainly it could. Yeah, sure. Well, what happened after the 2007 crisis was the collapse of demand globally, and also, well, disappearing of the credit globally. So I think in that case, the central bank, particularly of the key currency country, well, I think does have a responsibility to provide liquidity. Otherwise, the world.
What Mr. Draghi said in a somewhat different context, whatever is necessary.
Sure.
So we're done with questions. I want to invite each of you, if you would care to make a sort of closing remark, perhaps looking to the future, your next joint book.
My only comment about the future is about the past. Oh, to be 80 again.
During the last 20 years, in my view, finance has grown very much. And it produced good result, but at the same time, it created many problems. So I think we have to start reviewing the future role of finance in some way or other. Because, well, if you look back to history, finance used to be a very important supporter of real economy, but now it's a master of the economy, and it's, well, it's good, but at the same time, nobody is really in good control of that. So I think...
We had a lot of illusions about the value of free and open markets and all the new technology and financial engineering and rational markets and perfect foresight and all the rest is going to produce efficient real economy, growing real economy. I'm afraid that's all proved to be a bit of an illusion. And we've got to go back and find some balance of reasonable approaches and controls on the economy that had lapsed pretty much in the beginning of this century. And we're making some progress. I think we have the great Volcker rule.
I wish.
That's a small part of it. But,
Sometime we can do that joint seminar again on the role of finance up there. So please join us, but don't hurry.
And with that, please thank our panelists for a wonderful discussion.